Just the first name. What do you see? Yeah, no, we did.
So, let me say a few words, yes. So, Greece is the country where nobody ever can get bored. Can never get bored. Yes, it's an exciting country. So I've just been told that there is a kind of demonstration in front of the building, and they have locked up the doors. And yes, well, no. The university of what?
Locked up the doors.
Yeah, no, yes, the university has locked up the doors. Sorry. Thanks, Chloe. Anyway, we have to leave the building altogether, probably, which will be in 50 minutes from now, about. If somebody desperately wants to leave earlier, you should have to negotiate with the people responsible for the doors. Otherwise, just be patient, we will leave altogether at 2020 or 2025.
So we're
Yeah?
a captive audience, we have no option.
No, we're not captive yet.
So, it is really very interesting. Do you know what they're asking for?
There have been some occupations in other buildings in various universities, and the occupants have... Huh?
We got the same in the UK.
We got the same in
But the
Brazil,
occupants
actually.
have been, the occupiers have been removed from those buildings, and they demonstrate now in front of this central building, and yeah.
A democracy.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. I am in for Alex. Had to leave. So.
And we're very happy that I hope he's gone. He's not negotiating with the...
Oh yes, I will surely manage. Yes.
Exercise his dialect.
So everybody knows Professor Chloe Palla, still
Yes.
professor from University of Crete, one of our best, I would say, and she's going to talk about the longer and the shorter way, Athenian and Spartan overtones in Plato's law on marriage. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. I'm very happy to be in this audience, and I love the topic. My colleague Irini Viltagnotti, who spoke before, picked it, and I think it has proven very, very rich. And we have a strong, and I mean, there are a lot of things that came up in the talks in the morning that I will be picking on implicitly maybe, but and thank you Panagiotis for all your work, which was a lot. Looking forward to the new MA. So the longer and the shorter way, Athenian and Spartan overtones in Plato's law on marriage. There is a broader framework I will be referring to, and this framework, I think, to understand it, we can take a look at text 1 and 2. 2, we discussed it already and we all know it, and I take it as an emblematic text of the branding of the Athenians being as lovers of philosophy. I'm assuming that Plato is committed to this idea, except he changes the meaning of philosophy, but he remains an Athenian. Whereas the other important Socratic, Xenophon, has a different rapport with philosophy, not Platonic. So that's my framework. We can come back to this in discussion. And as an emblematic text of the latter attitude, Xenophon's, I cite text 1, a less known text by a novel by Chion of Heraclea. People think it's Hellenistic. And it's this guy who is going to attend Plato's academy, and he's worried a bit that this is not the right education for a man or for someone who wants to go back to politics eventually, I guess. And then he comes across Xenophon somewhere in the Byzantium. Xenophon is coming back with his troops. And he says, well, although Xenophon spent considerable time on discussions with Socrates, he was capable of rescuing armies and cities. So a completely different idea of what philosophy can do to you. So this is my general framework. I have an introductory observation. I'm assuming that when Plato in the Laws attributes to his Athenian the preamble on the proper time for marriage, he takes sides on an established debate between Athens and Sparta, and I'll say some things about what the preamble on the proper time for marriage is. And I want to make a claim and a suggestion that this debate, which I will explain around this text on the preamble on the proper time for marriage, is reflected in what I propose to see as an overlooked case of intertextuality between Plato, who represents the philosophical branding of Athens, which Plato aims to rehabilitate, and Xenophon, who represents the more practically oriented values of Sparta. So, in the first part of this paper, I suggest that this case of intertextuality corresponds to, and in fact showcases, to very different attitudes, which correspond to Athens and to Sparta, on the value, the function, and the constraints of law. In the second part, I draw attention to a contrast between, on the one hand, Socrates' notion of divine law in the Memorabilia, which I treat as an example of blind theodicy, and on the other hand, the robust notion of the cosmos, but also physis, that forms the backbone of Plato's side. It's already clear where there is overlap with other talks today. I suggest that the absence of the latter notion of cosmos, but also physis, from Xenophon's account, is what prevents his Socrates from describing divine law also as natural. It's never described as natural, it's only divine law in Book 4 of the Memorabilia. I assume that the two accounts that Plato and Xenophon represent point again to the two different directions that the juxtaposition that texts 1 and 2 showcase. Practical life versus the life which can be ruled by theory. Finally, I argue that surprisingly, and despite their contrast to one another, these two accounts have a common origin, which is the efforts that both Socratics make in order to apologize for their master. So, text 3, line 4 following from your handout. A man shall marry when he is 30 years old and under 35, bearing in mind that this is the way by which the human race, by some kind of nature, shares in immortality, a thing for which nature has implanted in everyone a keen desire. The desire to win glory instead of lying in a nameless grave aims at a like object. Thus mankind is by nature coeval with the whole of time, humankind, Γένος ουν ανθρώπων αισθήτης ξυμφιές του παντός χρόνου. I'm not reading the whole text, you have it as text 3. The law of the proper age for marriage in Plato's Laws is probably the best example the Athenian guest gives for the implementation of a legislative preamble, that is, of an argument through which the legislator persuades the citizens to obey the law. This type of law, described in the text as double, relies on the citizen's ability to respond to rational argumentation. There is some discussion about that, we can come back to it. And it is contrasted to its single and thus brief counterpart. In the latter version, obedience to the law is achieved through the threat of punishment. Because of its brevity, and so the title of my talk, the Spartan Megillus, the Athenian's interlocutor, describes the latter type of law as Laconian. He admits, however, despite the fact that he's Spartan, that if he had to choose which of these two statutes he should desire to have enacted in writing in his state, he should choose the longer, so even the Spartan. Megillus' characterization of the shorter version as Laconian turns on the contrast between the Spartan ideal of brevity on the one hand, and on the other hand, the Athenian interest in argumentation, in logos. Plato's Laconian version of the law comes immediately before this passage, where Megillus says that, and is confined to a formulation of the actual law and the penalties, the punishment transgressors will need to face, fear of which will presumably prevent its violation. That's beginning of text 3. And it's before the preamble that I read at the beginning. The obvious advantage of the double law is that it exercises persuasion. Citizens who listen to the preamble, like those who follow the philosophical argument that introduces the law, will observe it, not because they fear the functions they will face if they transgress it, but because they consider the value its observance has for a fulfilling life. With some hindsight, but also reading carefully or between Plato's lines, we can remark that the standards for such a fulfilling life are here provided by nature. Hence, the persuasion that is achieved through the legislative preamble is not the kind of persuasion that Plato and the Gorgias objected to, persuasion that could be attached to any thesis and can be achieved through emotional manipulation, flattery, through words. The persuasion that the legislative preamble exercises to the citizens is rather based on the power of argumentation, which, in Plato's Magnesia and in the best-case scenario, springs from the golden chain of logos that connects humans with the gods. The disadvantage of the double law is that it can only be persuasive to free citizens, free, to use Plato's analogy, that is presumably to people who are able to already to follow, to listen, and thus be persuaded by reason. The rest of the citizens, unfavorably compared by Plato to slaves, will follow the commands of the laws out of fear of the punishment that their disobedience will entail. The problem with a single law, which is what an ordinary law looks like, is that it cannot prevent people who only obey it because of fear of punishment from violating it when they are undetected, the Gyges ring problem. As we shall see, Plato must have been familiar with, but also chose to ignore, a different type of law, a different model of law that provided a solution to the Gyges ring problem. And this is the divine law, which according to Xenophon Socrates, is a type of law which entails the punishment of any transgressor, regardless of whether they are detected or not. What I find interesting for my present purposes is that the example of such a law that Xenophon Socrates uses can be described, admittedly in an indirect, implicit way, as a law which, just like Plato's law on marriage, that we considered above, regulates the proper time for procreation. So the subject matter is very similar, and hence my claim for a case of intertextuality. Before I turn to this law, let me draw attention to another text in which Xenophon discusses the value of marriage and which can lead us to some useful comparison to Plato's preamble on the proper time for marriage, and also to help us get a better grasp of the contrast between a Spartan and an Athenian angle. The text I have in mind is part of Socrates' conversation with Ischomachus in the Economicus. Ischomachus' argumentation, which is presented as a conversation between himself and his wife, lists the advantages of marriage as follows. In the first place, so that the various aspects of living creatures may not become extinct, the couple lies down together for the production of children. Secondly, offspring to support them in old age is provided by this union, or at any rate to human beings. The third advantage, on which Xenophon dwells more, has to do with the distribution of labor between husband and wife with regard to a special characteristic of human nature. As Ischomachus points out, human beings, quote, do not live in the open air like cattle, but obviously need shelter. And it is for all these reasons, says Ischomachus, that the gods gave to women a special kind of nature which law or custom, nomos, then further supported. For it is based on law that men and women are yoked, and again it is law that presumably orders that women must spend more time at home than outdoors. The invocation of the power of physis, nature, here in Xenophon is remarkable, but to contrast it with Plato, it fits Xenophon's agenda of, in contrast with Plato, it fits Xenophon's agenda of utility. Thus, whereas Plato sees procreation as man's communion to God, Xenophon turns on a much more pragmatic agenda. Living creatures should not be extinct. And we can think of Protagoras, the myth of Prometheus also. If a man, I'm quoting, and that's I think also on your handout number 4. Yes. If a man acts contrary to the nature that God has given him, possibly his defiance is detected by the gods, and he is punished for neglecting his own work or meddling with his wives. Ischomachus does not explain how exactly the defiance is detected by the gods or what kind of punishment expects them. Both issues, however, are addressed in the second text to which I want to draw attention, Memorabilia Book 4. In that text, Socrates uses the law against incest as an example of a law which, without ever having been written down, unlike the laws that are established by humans, is observed everywhere. Because it is observed everywhere without any previous communication among nations, this kind of law, says Socrates, must also be divine. The most distinctive characteristic of such a law is that when transgressed, it implies a punishment which wrongdoers will never be able to escape, regardless of whether they are witnessed, policed, or not. The law against incest meets this description since it presumably prevents older male relatives from having intercourse with young relatives, insofar as it might result in, entails, the unavoidable punishment of bad offspring. It's kind of shocking, the argument, but that's the reason why incest should be avoided. Let us now go back to Plato's text and compare it with those of Xenophon. Both authors provide some positive reasons for which human beings should get married, and they both pay attention to nomos, laws, possibly customs, but also to the sanctions that transgressors need to face. From a practical perspective, Xenophon's model of divine law has at least one obvious advantage. It answers the problem that arises from the thought experiment through which Glaucon challenges Socrates in the Republic, which is showcased in the story of Gyges' ring. For even in the absence of witnesses, citizens will obey the unwritten or divine law, as Xenophon Socrates describes it, out of fear for the unavoidable consequence that its transgression entails. Unlike Xenophon, Plato turns on a perspective that, with Plato's hindsight, we may describe as more theoretical. Citizens, at least the ones Plato, in the best case scenario of the laws, expects to be able to follow the preamble, the free citizens, which will follow the justification of the law, are treated not just as rational agents, for that would also be the case under Xenophon's model, but as mini philosophers, people who can follow an argument of the kind that Plato attributes to Diotima in the Symposium, which also turns on the idea of the desire all human beings feel to become immortal. And this aspect, I want to argue, is also related to the Athenian identity of the otherwise unknown speaker, a named speaker, the Athenian stranger. For unlike Xenophon, whose admiration for Sparta is beyond dispute, Plato, the founder of the Academy in Athens, remains committed to the power of language and argumentation, logos, even if, as he's surely aware, its proper study can only be pursued by, and regrettably only affect, a limited number of people. And even though in the Republic philosophers are forced to return to the cave, we have no way to tell if and how many of the students of Plato's Academy, which was founded at the suburbs of Athens, really cared about what happened in the city. Plato's version of the law on marriage, then, is part, I think, of a broader outlook that sees men, and to a certain extent also women, as beings who habitate the cosmos and flourish by exercising the reason and studying the workings of divine providence, and which presumably has much less to say about the ways in which such people will be put in the service of an army of the kind Xenophon is successfully leading. Scholars have often assumed that, unlike Plato, Xenophon is sticking closer to the content of discussions that the historical Socrates conducted, filtering them with an apologetic agenda, clearly stated in the beginning of Memorabilia, and likely also squaring them with Xenophon's own, but quite likely also Socrates' Spartan ideas. By contrast, Plato is using his philosophical imagination to square Socrates with Athens, think of the Crito and to some extent also the Republic, but also to attribute to him a new vision of natural science, which, as Plato goes out of his way to state, Socrates himself had not been able to fulfill. As David sadly points out, in the Phaedo, which is the dialogue in which Plato states Socrates' frustration with contemporary physics, the soul emerges as, quote, sadly, the direct beneficiary of a good cosmic arrangement, end of quote. The destiny that Plato provides to the most purified types of soul is the life of the philosopher, not of the man who will listen to Socrates admonishing him and who will accordingly develop the proper kind of virtues, which he can then put to practice, but the one who will spend his life, or a good amount of it, studying mathematics and astronomy, precisely in order to decipher and appreciate the workings of nature, which, by contrast to Plato, Xenophon, Socrates, gods did not wish humans to discover. Much can be said, of course, about the practical value of Plato's contribution, but also about the stochastic nature of his text, as we discussed earlier today. In the case of the preamble to the law of marriage, it seems clear that few people would be persuaded by its argument, so that the rest would obey the law either through the own reasoning, which would be closer to the more common sense reasoning of Xenophon, or because of the fear of sanctions. And after all, the law on marriage is not something, I mean, it's not a big enforcement of anything. And that would, of course, leave open the problem of undetected crime, which is a problem that Xenophon's divine laws addresses more effectively. To what extent Xenophon's presentation of Socrates is historically more accurate is of little importance for my present purposes, and it is in fact a question that tends to blur the importance of a dialogue among Socrates' successors and also what we call intra-Socratic polemics. That's what I am rather interested in here, is to show how at least some aspects of Xenophon's presentation of Socrates in connection to the divine law against incest can be seen as a foil to, or may even trigger, not only Plato's preamble to the law on the proper time for marriage, but also Plato's overall unprecedented conception of nature, a conception that indeed permeates the preamble to the law on marriage. And instead of assuming that either of the two Socratics can be used as a source for what the historical Socrates actually believed, I rather place the emphasis on the respective strategies they develop in order to dissociate their teacher from his Aristophanic persona. The difference to which I propose to draw attention now is the presence or absence of the notion of physis, nature, which plays some role in Plato's preamble on the law of marriage, but also in his laws quite generally, but, as we shall see, is rather absent from Xenophon's account. So I now turn to Xenophon's account of divine law. Book 4 of the Memorabilia, text 5. The broader context is of some importance for our purposes, for according to Plato's representation, Hippias was one of the sophists who had discussed the nomos physis antithesis and described nomos as a tyrant over human beings, which commits violence upon many things against nature. And the chapter in which this law, the divine law, occurs is exactly a discussion between Socrates and Hippias. In the beginning of his conversation with Socrates in the Memorabilia, Hippias professes to be able to speak about justice in a way that nobody would be able to challenge. But instead of giving his own argument, Hippias first asks Socrates to tell him what he thinks justice is. Triggered by Hippias' question, Socrates agrees, in a way reminiscent of the Crito, that the lawful is the same thing as the just. To this, Hippias replies, how could someone consider either the laws or obedience to them to be something worth taking seriously, given that the very people who establish them often reject and change them? That's text 7 on your handout. Hippias' objection is typical of the attitude of intellectuals who, disenchanted with Athens' politics, criticize democracy for passing laws in its own interest. And we discussed this with Vula this morning. In Xenophon's text, Hippias' objection becomes a foil to Socrates' commitment to the value of law, but also, and more particularly, to his notorious preference for Sparta, which he praises as a paradigm case of eunomia in Xenophon. And that could be the reason for which Xenophon downplays Hippias' interest in the nomos physis antithesis, assuming, of course, that Plato's testimony of the subject is accurate. The Plato making Hippias relevant to this discussion of nomos physis. But the complete absence of any reference to nature from a text that, under a different description, introduces what the Stoics would later describe as natural law seems rather strange. After all, it seems that the identification between divine and natural would be rather intuitive for someone like Hippias. His agreement with Socrates that unwritten laws are divine laws is based on the observation that different nations don't have a common language to communicate, hence they could not have just borrowed the laws that are everywhere the same, since to do so human beings would have to be able to understand different languages, and that presumably is out of the question. I'm mentioning this rather bizarre or even amusing argument in order to show how much more natural it would have been, especially for someone like Hippias, to invoke the language of the nomos physis antithesis and to argue that laws that are observed everywhere are stipulated by nature. But that is not a move Xenophon attributes to his Hippias or to his Socrates. One way to deal with this conundrum is to suggest that, unlike Plato, Xenophon is either not so familiar with or not so keen on the idea of natural order, the kind of order that Socrates in Plato's Gorgias associates with theories of some unnamed wise, presumably Pythagorean, maybe Archytas. To explain why Xenophon is reluctant to explore the idea of natural law, we may consider that thinking in terms of a well-defined domain of nature and a science that deals with it was not so trivial in his day, or before Aristotle wrote his physics, possibly. Another plausible explanation is that, again, unlike Plato, Xenophon's Socrates is interested in physics only in connection with his polemic against the atheists. But here I want to, and all this can be complementary, but here I want to make a different suggestion which has to do with Xenophon's Socratic apologetics. Let me then point out what I think is an interesting and, to the best of my knowledge, overlooked similarity between A, the skepticism concerning the identification of the lawful to the just that Xenophon attributes to Hippias, text 7, and B, the argument Aristophanes in his Clouds attributes to Pheidippides, which would be text 13. Yes, sorry. Well, wasn't it a man like you and me who originally established this law and persuaded by speech the ancients to adopt it? If so, am I any less allowed to establish in my turn a new law for the sons of tomorrow, that they should beat their fathers back? We award amnesty to fathers for all the blows we got before the law took effect, and we waive compensation for our beatings. Consider how the roosters and other such beasts avenge themselves on their fathers. And after all, how do they differ from us, except that they don't write decrees? Pheidippides' argument can be seen as an implementation of the advice it has received earlier in the play by the personified weak argument. That's text 14, your handout. I will just, yes, I will just read the last line in the Greek. Chrote physeis kirta gela nomize miden aischron. Some people think that this is the earliest occurrence of the nomos physis antithesis. This advice, which is given by the weak argument, is considered, I just said it, to be the earliest evidence that concerns the antithesis between nomos and physis. In the historiography of philosophy, this antithesis is typically associated with the sophists. But Socrates' contemporaries, who were the audience of the comedy, most likely associated this antithesis with Socrates' own teacher, Archelaus of Athens. It appears that Archelaus had described the transition from nature to civilization and remarked that, quote, what is just and what is shameful exists not by nature but by convention. That's text 15. There is no reason to assume that by drawing this distinction, Archelaus is endorsing the kind of argument that Aristophanes attributes to Pheidippides. And it is instructive to consider that, after all, Aristophanes is attributing the provocative advice of following one's nature and disregarding laws and customs not to Socrates, but rather to the weak logos, thus treating it as a counterintuitive thesis, the defense of which provided the teacher of argumentation with a challenge. So I do not want to argue that Aristophanes wanted to expose really Socrates' morality, but rather that this impression was in the air, and that Socrates could be, again, the elephant in the room for many Athenians. On the other hand, it seems likely that both Plato and Xenophon wished to remove from their teacher the suspicion that he, in fact, endorsed the teachings that Aristophanes implicitly attributed to him. Plato did that for the first time in the Gorgias, when he presented Socrates as an opponent of Callicles, a representative of a morally provocative version of the nomos physis contrast, and a proponent of a vision of the cosmos held together by communion and friendship, by orderliness, temperance, and justice. Thanks, Angie, for raising this earlier today. A vision which, however, Socrates and the Gorgias attributes to some unnamed wise men. Socrates furthermore accuses Callicles for his failure to understand geometry, thereby exposing the limits of Callicles' intellectual abilities, but also the limits of Plato's or Socrates' own approach, endeavor, an endeavor that, just like of the Athenian stranger in the laws, can only work for people who are already committed to philosophy. Just like Plato, so also Xenophon is sympathetic to the idea that rather than opposing nature, nomos may complement it. We find this in the Economicus. But unlike Plato, he's reluctant, he's not interested to develop a body of knowledge that would be of any relevance to the life of the citizen and the polis. And that, I believe, is the reason for which Xenophon, or Xenophon Socrates, never thinks of the unwritten divine law as natural law. I'm drawing to an end. More discussion or evidence would be needed to establish that these two perspectives indeed correspond to that of Athens and Sparta in particular. But one thing we may establish is that the comparison between Plato and Xenophon and the usefulness of triangulating towards Socrates is an important part of the background against which the two Socratics developed their different agendas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chloe, for giving us a few minutes for the debate. Yes, so Carol, please go on.
Thanks. Oh, that's really interesting, and I think you're absolutely right that looking at Xenophon and Plato together can tell us a lot about the Socratic tradition. But I think I'm going to disagree with you and say that the Spartan angle is a red herring. That I think that Xenophon is as engaged with thinking about Athens as Plato. The Memorabilia in particular is a work that's completely focused on Athenian society and customs and practice. Xenophon is, just like Plato, not an uncritical Sparta fan. Even when he's writing about Sparta and Spartans, he's very critical of them. He's particularly critical of their training, and he's particularly critical of their ethics. So you think of his criticism of Clearchus, the Spartan general, in the analysis, also the failure of Spartan training in various military episodes in the Hellenica. So I think that when Xenophon's doing philosophy, he's not thinking about Sparta.
Right, okay, yes, I am familiar with this trend in the literature, although I have not, and I'm very happy you're in the audience really, because it's a part that I haven't really studied. But so it's one thing for him not to be critical against Sparta, but wouldn't you think that he's less that he's still, I mean, the beginning, the juxtaposition of the practical and less intellectual. You wouldn't call this Spartan then, right? So you could, I could
I
reflect,
mean, not,
yeah.
I mean, yeah, obviously,
Yeah,
so there is a way in that, I think in the context of this, labelling Xenophon's
yeah,
practical approach, it's much more about a different approach to Athenian life. And when he writes about training, you think about things like the Hipparchicus, which is all about how to be a good Athenian cavalry officer,
Mhm.
not how to be a good Spartan fighter, how to be a good Athenian fighter. And at the point where Xenophon's writing, it's all, you know, Sparta's in the distant past for him. He's writing his works towards the end of his life, when he's been booted off his Spartan-funded estate in the Peloponnese. He's probably hanging out in Corinth. He may even have returned to Athens on occasion. He's engaged in this very much Athenian discourse. It's not Sparta's in the past for him.
And then, okay, if I can ask you further, where do you think, so this discourse about utility and being geared toward practice, that's his own thing?
I think that's probably pretty much everybody in Athens who was
Except Plato. Yes, yeah, okay. Okay, thank you.
Anyone else?
This is just a question out of ignorance. Archelaus, I've never worked with him at all.
Gabor Betek is working a lot with him.
Do we have dates for him when he was alive? Roughly?
Yes, they say he was a contemporary of Socrates, and some people, including Gabor Betek, think that when in the Phaedo play, Socrates says that someone gave him an Anaxagoras book, it was actually Archelaus, who was also, I mean, that's something I left out, a proponent. I mean, he's cited to have said that nous is not cosmopolos, so kind of a materialist, someone that, and then who was it that asked why it is that Archytas is absent from Gorgias? Instead of talking about Archelaus, Plato in the Phaedo talks about Anaxagoras, whereas again the elephant in the room would have been Plato's, Socrates' own teacher, Archelaus. And I think, I mean, I think that the nomos physis contrast, which is associated with Archelaus, and apparently is the earliest author to have argued for this break, is a reason. I mean, that I don't think we have evidence for anything else actually, for Plato's effort to show that characters like Callicles, I mean, people who are not historical to my eyes, argued in such a way, and then to show that Socrates had arguments against that. So he was not like what Athenians thought, who watched Aristophanes' Clouds.
Yes, please, Laura.
Well, thank you very much. This was very interesting. I am struck, I mean, this was a kind of not central to your talk, but I am asking for my own benefit. I am struck by this passage in Xenophon, where I think it's T11, that where Xenophon ascribes to Socrates not just that he's not interested in natural philosophy, which, I mean,
Sorry?
having Archelaus as a mentor, even an acquaintance, let alone a teacher, already that's a natural philosopher there. But Xenophon is saying here that he deprecated curiosity to learn how the deity contrives the heavenly phenomenon. I take it that he is referring
I guess there must be things in tragedy or how you can like let's reduce it to understand that. No. I think this is completely an apologetic line, and I think it's what Aristotle must have in mind in Metaphysics Alpha when he says that gods are not envious, or that they will let you carry on with Sophia. I think this is Xenophon again.
But it must be, and I am kind of interested in this idea of an interplay with Plato and very different.
Yes, I mean one could say that it's not Xenophon, it's Socrates, but we just can't know.
Right, but I mean, I think that this is something that I would find it hard to believe in opinion intellectual. I'm speaking about Xenophon now.
Mhm.
Athenian, not in the sense of origin, but Athenian in the sense of being involved in the debates in Athens, rather than representing some other point of view, to say something like this, or to ascribe.
It's very anti-philosophical. Yes, and yes. Well, we had a discussion about philosophy in Xenophon, and there are people who think that Xenophon can be read as someone who does philosophy. I think this is completely alien to me. The idea that I mean, Xenophon talks about morality, I guess, and he's a very good source of ideas that must have been current among philosophers. But I can't see him as a philosopher himself. And I think the agenda here is very apologetic on the one hand and very religious on the other hand. I mean, and again, David Sedley uses the term religious creationism to contrast it to scientific creationism, and he attributes the former to Xenophon's arguments. So David thinks it's Socrates actually. I don't see why we can establish this. And it's a very original thought, the argument from Design-Homes, which is only confined to the agenda of attacking the atheist. So I think that there is a clear intra-Socratic polemics there between Xenophon and Plato, and who knows, maybe the Socrates we know from Plato is Socrates' own fabrication, his own effort to show what his teacher could have been like, and pointing to the kind of philosophy that he, Plato, as opposed to everybody else, especially if we take Carol's point that everybody else was like Xenophon. So Plato used Socrates and some things he had said and made a completely different thing.
May I just, Carol asked to say, but just a suggestion. Could it be just a response to Aristophanes' clouds, like an apology of Socrates?
That's
Just-
for sure, yes. That
Like,
he's not
it was
frontistees,
not like that.
and that he's not a front, that he should advise people to not to be frontistine. It's clear that this is this. Yes.
He was a good guy, so Socrates was a good guy.
He was a good guy.
I haven't
yes.
done nothing outside of the civical
Yeah,
region.
but that's more than just him being a good guy. He has an extra argument, a bonus argument,
Yeah.
that you should not meddle with divine business.
We have time for one more question. If maybe we should. No, I don't have anyone. So please.
I was just going to say, I think that actually it sort of comes down to a kind of disciplinary boundary question over what constitutes philosophy and what doesn't. And Xenophon clearly does exactly what people now call applied philosophy. That's looking about. And Plato clearly does a very different kind of philosophy.
Yeah, I wouldn't have said what I said in a different audience.
Yeah, exactly.
I forgot you were here.
I will send you. I will send you.
Yeah,
I'll
please,
send you
please.
the manuscript of my little Xenophon book.
Yeah,
Which
excellent, excellent.
explains
Thank
why
you
he
very
really
much.
is a
Yeah,
philosopher.
Yeah. I am actually curious to see what you think about physis, because I noticed that I assume that this is not something that very common in Plato. It comes late. It comes in the laws, maybe. I don't know if it comes in the Chinese. I think it doesn't.
Okay, that's very great. Please, yes.
Oh, no, don't worry.
No, we have 2 minutes. 3.
Or the whole night, we'll find out.
Feel free to shout this down, because I've actually, listened to your talk, I've ended up with a possibly slightly different conclusion from the one you were aiming for, which is actually, it's brought home to me that in some respects, there is one really important similarity between Plato and Xenophon.
Okay.
Whether the philosophers, whether Xenophon's a philosopher or not, they're both deeply committed to Athens. They both care about Athens. They both think Athens could be improved. And they both think that there are a few elements of Sparta can help. But it's not that Xenophon is a Spartan, or wants to incorporate, or Socrates is a Spartan. But they're both open to bringing in a few very regular, not all of it, they loathe a lot of it, but some Spartan influences they think would purify and refresh Athens.
Yeah,
But
I
they
mean,
both- they
this
both
is,
have
I will read Carol's manuscript, but I don't think I will. This is something that is really very important for my argument. If it's not for this, the Athenian branding. But I was thinking of the Athenian branding connected to philosophy and logos, and also about Spartans, the Spartans' lack of this kind of education. But what you're saying is that Xenophon is pro this kind of education anyway, except this kind of education for him is a different kind of education than what we don't know if you would describe this as philosophy exactly, but it doesn't matter, something like that. Yeah.
So let's do some noise. Yes, so will we be here at this
I
very
think
place tomorrow?
we can leave the building.
No, tomorrow at 10.
Yes, tomorrow.
Yeah, but we'll
Sharp.
do tomorrow. Yeah.
Yes, sharp.
If not, we will stay here up till tomorrow. Yeah. Thank you. We did it.
Not false alarm, but there is no acute danger, so to say, right now.